Well, just to help me out on this, Professor Allan, I mean, you hardly protect someone's basic human rights by legislating for those human rights. In fact, the argument from people like me, I'm sure from you too, I've read many of the things you said on this in the past, is that you actually water down their rights by putting them in a statute. Isn't that right?
Well, the thing about any sort of Bill of Rights, Peta, whether it's constitutionalized or statutory, is effectively when you buy a Bill of Rights, you buy the view or the views of the unelected judges. And so when the president of the Law Council or the Julian Burnsides of the world push for one of these instruments, what they really want to do is take social policy out of the hands of the elected legislature and put it into the hands of the unelected judiciary. And the reason they want to do that is they know that they're going to get more left-leaning results. And we can see this even with our high court, even with a high court where most of the judges have been appointed by the Libs. They have crazy decisions like that aliens love decision. There's no way any of those kind of decisions would ever get through a parliament. And so they'll use any opportunity to try to push this. They've been doing it for 20 years. They've lost 2 constitutional referenda. But the idea that they really are pushing this in the face of lockdowns that'll do a better job of protecting all of us, our rights, our civil liberties during a lockdown, it's just patent nonsense and incredibly hypocritical. The 2 states in Australia
let's go to that point, because we've got the ACT, Queensland and Victoria. All of those jurisdictions have a Human Rights Act. But when Daniel Andrews was determined to ram it through the Parliament, which he did at 2 a.m. one morning, the extension to the state of emergency, the extension to the state of disaster, I didn't hear many Human Rights Act arguments being put around the upper house in the Victorian Parliament.
I didn't hear anything either. And in fact, when the pregnant woman was being dragged out of her house by the police, I didn't hear anything. We went 3 or 4 months. I mean, there's been quite a few of us who've been very antsy about these lockdowns and the infringements on civil liberties, but it wasn't the usual suspects in the pro-Bill of Rights camp. They haven't even come on board until very recently, and even then it's in a very minor way. You can take the comparison overseas, where there's very potent bills of rights. Canada, Britain, where you can barely say anything anymore, there's so little free speech. Again, potent bills of rights has done nothing. Again, let me say this again. If you favor a Bill of Rights, what you really are saying is you want decision-making power moved to the lawyerly caste, the unelected judiciary. And so they will look for any excuse. Luckily, so far in Australia, we've withstood this. But it's laughable to think that it would have done anything about the lockdowns.
So what's behind the push by the Law Council of Australia to use the pandemic, use people's loss of liberties to argue, they say, for a Charter of Rights which will restore our liberties? You say, in fact, that makes them in a worse state than where we are now.
Well, this is nothing new. Of course, every 3 or 4 years they bring up another attempt. They'll use any sort of current affair to try to push for a Bill of Rights. The last time they tried for a constitutional one was in 1988, and it lost even in Victoria. It lost in every state. And then when Mr. Rudd was in power, they tried for a statutory one, and they couldn't even get the numbers to try to put a statutory one in. Look, it's not popular with the voting public. So they'll use any guise they can. I think my view is, and this is just speculation, that you have to understand that the lawyerly caste is significantly to the political left of the median voter. Now, when I say political left, I don't mean your redistribution of wealth, left-wing outlook, which I'm moderately sympathetic to. I mean your sort of Julian Burnside human rights lawyerly outlook. And they are much more comfortable with judges and lawyers making social policy calls. And that's the Law Council for you in a nutshell. Even in Australia without a Bill of Rights, our top judges, the High Court, have more or less invented a implied freedom, goes back to the early 90s. And if you look at all of the cases where the High Court of Australia has struck down legislation, except for the very first case, which was a labor legislation, every case where they've actually struck legislation down has been liberal legislation. Nobody talks about that, all right? but that is the fact. Now, they don't do it very often because there's no legitimacy, there's no Bill of Rights. They've sort of made up a sort of enervated little minor Bill of Rights type thing. But the way the framework works for thinking about the world, where you think about proportionality and you think about reasonable limits, it's all reasonable limits from the point of view of a cocooned class of unelected judges. And they are much more sympathetic with big government, speech inhibiting, left-wing sort of legislation that doesn't get struck down. They're very uncomfortable with right-of-center legislation. So this is not politically neutral.
We know in Victoria already there's a number of legal actions on foot, predominantly at this stage from commercial entities who have suffered really significant financial damage in the lockdowns. There's expected to be a whole lot of other actions, particularly class actions, come forward in relation to the lockdowns, the deleterious effect on people's liberty, etc. What do you think the chances are that these sorts of lawsuits will succeed?
Well, this is speculation, and I probably differ a bit from you on this, Peta, but I blame Mr. Morrison for some of this as well. I mean, he can't stop supporting these crazy premiers. And if the federal government had actually supported the border challenges, I think Section 92 challenge would have succeeded. Mm-hmm. But we're left hoping that Mr. Palmer succeeds. So that I'd preface it that way. Well, you'd be a brave person who had any confidence in the Victorian judiciary after what we saw with Mr. Pell. So I don't even know how to speculate about what would happen with the Victorian courts. By the time it makes its way to the High Court, of course, it'll all probably be moot. So that, to some extent, I think that's one of the problems we're facing. By the time it gets to the High Court, sorry.
No, just a quick one before we go. I'm interested, do you think we need, and I certainly do, having the experience of looking closely at what's gone on in the Coate inquiry in Victoria, do you think we need a Federal Royal Commission into all the lessons we've learnt from this pandemic, all the things we've got right, obviously, but looking at Victoria and looking at South Australia and the massive back down today, the things that we've got wrong as well?
Yes, I think that we got more wrong than you think, because if you look at other countries in the Southern Hemisphere, countries like Japan and Taiwan, which didn't lock down and have fewer deaths per million than we do, to a large extent, I don't think lockdowns are responsible for any of this. So you and I might differ on that. I'm a little bit cynical about all these royal commissions and inquiries. All the information is there. We know everything. The politicians ought to do their job and stop pawning it off. I don't trust these royal commissions. I don't trust these inquiries. I don't like reports that come out and make findings of fact as if they're sort of godlike findings. So, the politicians are elected to do their jobs. They don't need to pawn it off. We have enough information to know, where we've screwed up already. Now, you might be right in this sense. Most of the screwing up was done by the politicians, so it's pretty hard for them to admit that. So maybe in this instance you're right, but you'd have to pick the right person or people to run it, and I can't really see that happening.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I agree with you. I don't like government by Royal Commission, but I also don't like the situation where you have 800 dead and everyone says, I can't remember and I don't recall. So that's a problem Victoria's in.